If you were born between 1977 and 1983, you've probably spent your whole life being shoved into a box that doesn't fit. Too young for Gen X, too old for millennial. And somewhere in that gap, there's actually a name for what you are. Researchers started calling this group Xennials around 2014, a micro-generation, a small window of people whose psychology doesn't quite match either side. And when you look at what happened during those specific years, what you lived through and when you lived through it, it starts to explain a lot. Today, I want to walk through what makes Xennials psychologically distinct, not in a "you're special" way, in a "this actually explains why you are the way you are" way. From the start, your childhood was analog, fully, completely analog. You remember phone numbers, you remember passing notes in class, actual folded paper, not messages. You remember making plans with someone and then just showing up. No confirmation text, no "I'm here" message. You walked to the spot and you hoped they'd be there. And if you missed your favorite TV show, it was gone. Just gone. There was no recording it, no streaming it later. You sat with that. You learned to sit with things. But then, right as you were finishing high school or starting your 20s, the entire world went digital. Not slowly. It felt like overnight. One year, you're calling your friend's house and hoping their mom doesn't answer. The next year, you have an email address, a cell phone, and you're registering for something called Friendster. And here's what's interesting from a psychological standpoint. Research on brain development shows that the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that handles adapting to new situations and learning complex skills, continues developing well into your mid-20s. A major NIH longitudinal study found this region doesn't fully mature until roughly age 25. That means Xennials went through the biggest technological shift in modern history while their brains were still in a high plasticity window. You weren't just learning new tools, your brain was being architecturally reshaped by the transition itself. You were young enough that picking up technology felt natural, but old enough to remember everything that came before it. And that combination created something researchers have compared to a kind of bilingualism. You're fluent in both worlds. You can sit in a room without reaching for your phone, but you can also learn any new software thrown at you without panic. That's not a quirk. That's a rare neurological position that most people on either side of you don't share. And this shows up in places you might not even think about, like your relationship with privacy. Everything embarrassing you did as a teenager, every bad haircut and every terrible outfit, every breakup, every night you'd rather not think about, it just faded. There's no photo evidence, no tagged post, no screenshot. It exists only in the stories people tell, and those stories get softer over time, because that's what human memory does. It edits. It keeps what matters and lets the rest go. Research on autobiographical memory confirms this. The brain is literally designed to reshape personal experiences over time. That's not a flaw in the system. That's how we heal, how we grow past things, how we stop being defined by our worst moments. But when everything is permanently documented and searchable, when your past lives on a server, that natural process gets complicated in ways psychologists are still trying to understand. Xennials grew up in the last window where your past could genuinely fade, where your memories could evolve into stories instead of staying frozen as evidence. And that might be a bigger psychological gift than most people realize. Think about how your friendships were built. Before you could text someone, before you could check their location, before you could see what they were doing on a story, you had to just trust them. You made plans on a landline 2 days in advance, and then you showed up. That required a completely different kind of commitment than what exists now. Prior to social media, most people had maybe 3 ways to contact someone: their home phone, their work phone, or just showing up at their house. That was it. And that limitation created something that's genuinely hard to replicate now. Relationships built on physical presence, on reading body language, on spending unstructured time together with no agenda and no escape into a screen. Then, suddenly, you're in your 20s, and there are 17 different messaging apps, and you figured it out. You moved between both worlds without losing the instincts the first one gave you. But here's what that means psychologically. You know the difference between being reachable and being connected. You experienced a real connection before the tools existed to simulate it. And that gives you a kind of emotional radar that's hard to explain to someone who's never known anything else. You don't trust easily, but when you do, it's because someone showed up, not because they liked your post. Now here's where things get complicated, and this is the part most generational content about Xennials skips entirely. If you were born between 1977 and 1983, you didn't just live through one economic crisis, you lived through two, at exactly the worst times. The dot-com crash hit in 2001, the NASDAQ lost nearly 80% of its value, unemployment climbed from 3.9% to over 6%, and Xennials were between 18 and 24 years old. Right at the moment you were supposed to be stepping into the workforce, the floor dropped out. Entry-level jobs vanished, career plans evaporated. You scrambled. And then, just when you'd rebuilt, just when you'd found your footing, maybe bought a house, maybe started a family, 2008 happened. The housing market collapsed, unemployment hit 10%, and this time you weren't a 22-year-old with nothing to lose. You were in your late 20s or early 30s with real obligations and a career that suddenly felt like sand. Research on economic hardship shows that financial instability during your career-building years, your 20s and 30s, creates lasting psychological effects. It reshapes how you think about money, security, and risk in ways that don't go away even after things improve. People who get hit during these specific years carry it forward. It becomes part of how you make decisions. So you've got this generation that learned to adapt to massive technological change, but also got economically blindsided twice before they turned 35. That's why you probably still have a contingency plan you've never told anyone about. That's not anxiety, that's pattern recognition. Quick thing, if this is resonating with you, I genuinely appreciate you subscribing. This channel is about the patterns most people miss. Now, let's keep going. Here's what seems to define Xennials more than anything else, and it's genuinely unusual. You have the self-reliance and skepticism of Gen X. Your parents probably didn't know where you were for hours at a time, and that was just normal. You learned to solve problems on your own, to entertain yourself, to deal with boredom and frustration without immediate adult intervention. Nobody was managing your emotional experience. But then, right as you were finishing high school or starting your 20s, the early internet era had that feeling of pure possibility. Before we all realized it might be making some things more complicated than they were before. You carry the optimism of that moment alongside the skepticism of everything that came before it. And somehow, you hold both, without it feeling contradictory. Independent and cooperative, skeptical yet hopeful, analog but digital. You remember the before and the after, which means you can see what was gained and what was lost. You're not as nostalgic as Gen X because you genuinely appreciate modern conveniences, but you still recognize what we gave up. You lost the ability to be truly unreachable. You lost the patience that comes from waiting. You lost a certain kind of presence that existed when there wasn't always something else competing for your attention. But the gain came with connection, information, and possibilities your younger self couldn't have imagined. And that ability to hold both truths at once, to see the loss and the gain without choosing sides, that's not confusion, that's depth. And it's something most people on either side of you can't quite do. And there's one more thing worth mentioning. You know what actual boredom feels like, not nothing good is on boredom, real boredom. A summer afternoon with no screen, no plan, no stimulation, just you and the sound of a sprinkler somewhere down the street. You'd take apart a radio, ride your bike in circles, lie on the carpet and stare at the ceiling for an hour. And that wasn't wasted time. Neuroscientists call what happens during unstructured downtime default mode network activation. It's the state your brain enters when nothing external is competing for your attention, and it's where creativity actually lives, where your brain makes unexpected connections, processes things in the background, solves problems you didn't know you were carrying. Xennials might be the last generation that experienced deep, uninterrupted boredom during adolescence and then watched it disappear from the world. You built mental infrastructure that no app can replicate, and you did it by doing absolutely nothing. If you're a Xennial, you probably feel like you don't quite fit in anywhere, too young for some things, too old for others, caught between two worlds that keep moving in different directions. That's not a flaw. That's actually the defining feature of your experience. You lived through one complete paradigm shift, analog to digital, during the exact years when your brain was still learning how to make sense of the world.
You weathered 2 economic collapses before you turned 35. You built friendships on trust and presence before the tools existed to shortcut both. And you carry the contradictions of all of it without falling apart. In a world that keeps changing faster than anyone can predict, having already lived through one massive transition might be the most valuable thing you could have learned. Not because you're special in some superior way, but because you lived through a specific moment in history that taught you something the rest of us are still figuring out: how to adapt without losing yourself in the process. If any of this resonated, drop which part hit hardest in the comments. I'm curious which of these patterns you recognized in yourself. If this is your first time here, this channel is about the patterns most people miss in relationships, at work, in families, in generations. Subscribe if that sounds like something worth paying attention to. And if you'd rather read than watch, there's a weekly newsletter in the description. No fluff, just patterns worth seeing. You grew up analog. You built your life digital. You learned to read people before you ever read a screen. And you've been holding 2 worlds together your entire life without anyone noticing. You're not hard to place. You're just paying attention. You're not paranoid. You're perceptive.